Thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to get this webinar underway, just not wait any longer. I just want to welcome everybody that's joined us today. It's very exciting to have you here. This is the second of 3 in our CopRice nutrition webinar series we're offering this season, really focused on feedlotting and to get across some really good insights to help you maximise the performance of your animals this season. So basically, I'd like to quickly introduce myself and our team before we get underway. To start with, my name's Adele Graham. I look after our ruminant marketing here at CopRice, and we've got some great guest speakers online today to really share some really good insights all about feed additives today and the role that they play. To start with, we've got Nicole Logg. She's one of our senior CopRice nutritionists. She's qualified in livestock and equine nutrition with over 20 years experience in formulation and on-farm support, really across that sheep, beef and equine industries. So her passion lies in product innovation and using that scientific research to really improve the feed rations on farm for helping you achieve that maximum health and performance of your livestock animals. We also have Jess Hardy, our graduate nutritionist in CopRice. She's originally from Leeton. Jess returned to the Sunrise Country and joined our skilled and passionate CopRice nutrition team here at CopRice. And Jess has completed an honours degree in ruminant nutrition and is really passionate about providing livestock producers as well as equine enthusiasts the latest in nutrition advances. We also welcome Kate Hearn from Biome, and she's Bioman, and she's a technical sales manager. She's specialising in mycotoxins, which is a really interesting topic and really relevant in this discussion today. So she works on providing solutions to this issue of mycotoxins with really innovative and high quality mycotoxin binders and testing from Bioman. So before we get underway, just a little bit of housekeeping, a quick mention that this webinar will be recorded. So if at any time your connection drops or you wanted to rewatch it, we will be posting the recorded session up on our website for later viewing. We do encourage questions. We're here live for you to answer any questions you have. You'll find a little Q&A box, a question answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please type that in at any time throughout the presentation, and we'll be answering questions live at the end of the session. Also, for our webinar guests, we have exclusive offers today, so make sure to stay to the end and we'll be giving you details on what they are and how you can definitely save some money on some CopRice products at the end of this. So without further delay, let's get underway. Over to you, Jess, to kick us off today.
Thanks, Adele. So, the role of feed additives. Why do we need them? Today we'll be discussing with Nicole and Kate as well. Whilst a feed additive will add cost to your ration, it is a critical part of the profitability of your feedlot operation. So let's look at this simple profit equation. Profit equals quantity sold times price received minus your cost of production. So cost of production being feed costs and labour. What we can influence on farm is our quantity sold. So how do we maximise the quantity sold? Let's look at reducing mortality rates. The 2 key nutritional issues that we see in lamb feedlotting is acidosis and urinary calculi. Today we're going to be discussing how feed additives can assist in reducing the incidence of these. Similarly, this season we may notice a high incidence of mycotoxins. So we're going to discuss how we can optimise health to reduce the number of poor-doing lambs, thus reducing the number of days on feed and lowering that cost of production, ultimately increasing the profitability of our lamb feedlot. So, preparing a safe and cost-effective feedlot ration. The role of feed additives, why we need them, and how they help prevent some of these key nutritional issues. So firstly, acidosis, how to safeguard rumen health with effective feed additives. Secondly, urinary calculi, aka water belly, why it occurs and how to prevent it. And then thirdly, the hidden dangers of mycotoxins. What are they and how to protect against them? Acidosis is one of the most common causes of death and poor performance in the feedlot. Nicole, can you talk to us today on how we minimise acidosis?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Yeah, acidosis is always a big one, also commonly referred to as grain poisoning. So sort of gives you a hint into how acidosis occurs. And we know that we come onto grain, but it's really the starch that's in the grain that's causing that acidosis. So I'll just do a little deep dive into acidosis so we've got a bit of an understanding of it, and then we'll go through how we can prevent it. So essentially the rumen contains a whole range of microbes, and we can broadly categorise these into fibre-loving and which like a relatively neutral pH. Now, pH is the acidity level really of the rumen. So pH works on a scale of 1 to 14, with 7 being neutral. So acids, really acids on the one side of the scale, and then really alkalines up above 7 on the other side of the scale. So a rumen environment really likes it to sit at around 6 and 7, and these fibre-loving bacteria like that relatively neutral pH. Then we also have our starch-loving bacteria, and they can tolerate a lot more acidic conditions, so coming down on that pH scale. So normally when sheep are grazing out in the paddock, there's a lot of fibre in there. The microbes are in a good balance and everything's pretty healthy and hunky-dory. But when we bring them into the feedlot, obviously we're going to put some more grain into them because we want to bring some more energy in and start to drive growth rates. So we put them onto grain. Now grain is obviously because there's a high proportion of starch onto it. And we went over in webinar 1 a little bit of difference of grain and the starch levels through induction. So please refer back to webinar 1 on our website if you want a little bit more info on those starch levels and induction. But when we bring them into the feedlot, they move on to a grain-based ration. And we're starting to deliver more starch into that microbial environment. So as we increase that grain, those starch-loving bacteria start to proliferate. And whilst that's good and we want starch in there, those microbes will break it down into what we call volatile fatty acids. Pretty interesting name, but they essentially will go to the liver and be converted into glucose, and that's what drives your production. So whilst we want that starch in there to help give them that extra energy, what happens is we start to increase the total starch load, acid load, in the rumen. And from there's also another acid that's produced called lactic acid. So naturally, these are actually normally produced by these starch-loving microbes, but they're imbalanced by some of the other microbes in there, which are actually lactic acid utilising bacteria. So they'll actually use that up, and it usually stays in balance. So where we start to see problems is if we've got a lot of starch coming in, we get a lot of acid coming in, the pH starts to drop from the total acid load, and those fibre-loving bacteria and some of those bacteria that like to use that lactate up start to die off, and that's where we start to see things snowball out of control a little bit. So lactic acid or lactate is a really strong acid, and that drops the pH really fast and really quickly there. So that's where we start to see those sort of sudden cases of lambs dying of acidosis because we've got a really strong acid load in there. So before that happens, or after that happens, you may even see some lambs that, you might not see them obviously a death from acidosis, but they might just never quite recover. And that the pictures that I've got up there on the screen, we've got the healthy rumen papillae, really dark and vascular, lots of papillae there, and that's points where those volatile fatty acids can be absorbed into the rumen. When we get a really high acid load and a lot of strong acid in there, if they're still alive, we can do permanent damage to the rumen. And the photo on the right there shows all the scarring that can occur from the acid load, and you can see that those papillae have died off and it's not as rich and vascular as the one on the left. So they might have that throughout the feeding program, and that could be the cause of some of your poor doing animals later on that sort of sometimes take a lot longer to finish. We've damaged their rumen so much that's really a permanent thing. So that slow induction onto grain is a really, really key part of your whole lamb feedlotting process. You need to do it at the start properly. It is in webinar 1. We went over that, as I mentioned, but it's really, really crucial to set them up properly so we don't end up with rumen damage that will last the length of the feedlotting program. And similarly with your feeders, so never ever let your feeders run out. Obviously, mistakes could happen, or you didn't know they've gone through so much so quickly. And if that does happen, you need to close those slides back down and sort of start them off at induction again to try and reduce what can happen. If you fill those feeders up, they come in, they gorge, you can have these acidosis events type happening, or you can lead to permanent scarring down the rumen wall. So a couple of tips there. But good quality roughage is also really, really important. And what I mean by good quality roughage is just that it's not weather damaged or mouldy, hasn't been sitting out in the weather for a long time, that sort of thing. It's just got to be fresh and palatable. They're going to want to eat it. So it is important for rumen function. And we talk about also effective fibre. So muzzle width, if it's longer than muzzle width, that's what we call effective fibre. And that just helps that lamb chew, and that saliva contains natural buffers. The fibre goes down into the rumen, and it helps the rumen contract and turn over, digesting those nutrients really well. So fibre is really important to have on hand, just to have it there. And another little tip is if you put it in between your water point and your self feeder, just to encourage them to eat that straw or cereal hay along the way, because otherwise you get some lambs that will just stand at a feeder and go back and forth to the water trough and not eat much roughage, but you'll get a lot better digestion out of your feed if you have that roughage available. So as I mentioned, it helps, the chewing action helps saliva production, and we've got a lot of natural buffers that will come down into that rumen to help digest that feed better.
All right, speaking of buffers, there are a range of different buffers on the market to protect against acidosis. What are your thoughts on these, Nicole, and why are additional buffers necessary?
Yeah, there are a few different types of buffers around. The most common one is bicarb, which is actually sodium bicarbonate. That's probably the most common one you see around. You do need a fair bit of it to be effective. So buffers will be what will change that pH and make that pH, bring it back up to more neutral, where we have a bit better balance for those rumen microbes to work effectively. The other one is an older sort of one around called bentonite. It's actually sodium bentonite. That's sort of still around. You see it around a little bit. Again, it's just not as quite effective as even bicarb, but it will sort of have a little bit of a buffering action in there. Bovatec's another one that's sort of been touted in some circles as a product to protect against acidosis, but it's actually not truly a buffer. Like it doesn't soak up those acid ions, so it's not truly a buffer in the sense that it helps with those acidotic conditions, and it's actually not approved by the APVMA, which is the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Association, for the prevention of acidosis. And we'll get more into Bovatec in webinar 3, where we look at feed conversion efficiency and go a bit more into its mode of action there. But it's not truly a buffer. It has does other things in the rumen. But when we talk about buffers, we're really talking about changing that pH. So another product that's been around for quite a few years now and it's got a plethora of research on it to support its performance is a product called Acid Buff, and I think it's by far the best buffer on the market. And Acid Buff is it's actually a calcified marine algae of all things, but it has a really great honeycomb-like structure. So what that does is that the rumen acid can get in there, and all that surface area of that honeycomb sort of type structure it's just a greater surface area for those to absorb all those hydrogen ions, all the acids that come in there. So it's really good at absorbing the acids, and the buffering capability will last a long time as well. So the graph on that right there, our control ration. So this ration was with feeding cattle, but it's a similar scenario when lambs come in at different times to eat at the trough. We've got a control ration, which is red. We had a sodium bicarb control group and the acid buff in another group. So this is a high concentrate diet, and you can see there after that first feeding time at around 8 o'clock in the morning, the pH starts to drop. Now our real line in the sand is that pH of 5.5, so it's getting quite acidic there, and below that, that's when we really start to sort of snowball out of control a little bit in terms of pH and lactic acid load and total acid load as well. So we can see there that they all start to drop off at feeding time, The control group that didn't have any buffers, really hit 5.5 before the actual next feeding time there, whereas the acid buff and the bicarb, their buffering capability sort of kicked in. And then we can see at that second feeding time that, it drops off a little bit further again. So the control group stays under that pH of 5.5 for quite a long time, for 15 hours, in fact. The bicarb did a pretty good job. It dipped down a little bit later on below that 5.5, and that stayed under 5.5 for actually 8 hours. And whereas the acid buff, you can see they're really strong buffer capabilities and can do it for an extended period of time. And it was only 3 hours where the pH was below 5.5, so really strong action. Now, bicarb still, it's still good there, but it's just we want to make sure that we keep that rumen environment closest to a better pH for those rumen microbes that we can, and that's why we choose acid buff as our buffer of choice in our vitamin buff range of concentrates.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So while focusing on rumen health and acidosis prevention, I know we have another special additive in our V&B concentrate. Can you share with us a bit more about this?
Yes, we do. Now we've looked into this when we put this put our vitamin buff product together, and it's using yeast culture. So yeast culture is really a bit of it's a prebiotic. It's food for the bacteria in the rumen, and what that does is it's providing substrates or food to help those microbes digest feed better. And the really nice thing is it actually provides sort of food specifically for those lactic acid utilising bacteria, so the ones that are going to use up the lactate that's in there. So we try and really support their health and give them substrates that they need to stay alive, and in that way we get a better balance and we don't sort of run down into that drop of pH as quickly. By feeding these lactic acid utilising bacteria, we're also feeding the fibre loving bacteria as well. So we're trying to keep them healthy, and that improves the fibre digestion. So the lambs in the feedlot, even if straw or cereal hays ad lib, they will naturally eat about 10% of their daily intake of that roughage. So if we can, even though there's probably, there's not a lot of energy and protein coming in from that, but if we can improve that fibre digestibility, it actually has an effect on reducing the heat stress of the animal as well. So really important over the summer months when we're feedlotting, or days like today even, where, it's quite hot. And so if the way it reduces heat stress is it digests the fibre better. So when fibre's digested, it takes a long time, and you get this what we call heat of fermentation that comes off as well. So if we can reduce that total heat of fermentation load by digesting it a bit quicker and a bit more effectively, we can reduce the total heat load of the animal. So it improves microbial protein yield. So what does that mean? If we can feed and keep these microbes happy in the rumen, ultimately they have their own little life cycle. They will die off, but the fourth stomach of the ruminant will actually use that protein source in the small intestine. So we'll use those microbes as a protein source later on. So we can feed those microbes and keep them healthy. Once their little life cycle's ended, they will pass through and be used as a protein source as well. And a lot of the research that they've done also has a really positive outcome in relation to their immune system and immune health, which is actually really important in that lamb feedlot. They've got a lot of stresses, there's a lot going on, so if we can help support their immune system, they're going to perform better as well. So it really works on, acid buff and yeast culture work really, really nicely together to give a really nice, healthy, balanced rumen environment, which will lead to better growth rates, better utilisation of your feed, and that results in less days on feed, saving you feed costs at the end of the day, but also keeping your animals alive as well, so you've got more to sell at the end of it.
All right, great. Thank you, Nicole. So, along with protection against acidosis, the role of a good feed additive is to balance the diet and protect against urinary calculi. One of the other common causes of death later in a feeding program is urinary calculi. Nicole, what causes urinary calculi and how do we reduce its incidence?
Yeah, it's a big one, Jess. We've got a lot of producers that are pretty good at introducing animals onto grain, and it gets really frustrating when you're a couple of months in or so and you get urinary calculi. So calculi is effectively the name for stone. And urinary means it happens in the urinary tract, in particular the urethra. So the little diagram there of the anatomy of the male goat urethra. Goats are really sensitive to urinary calculi, as are merino wethers. But it can happen in all sheep, but they're the most susceptible to it. Now, what happens is a little stone will form, and you can see there that red circle, the sigmoid flexure is a really common area where this little stone forms or blocks up really. In that little point there, and that's where that stone will form. It'll block up. The animal will initially have trouble urinating, and then ultimately that will block the urethra entirely, and we get a distended bladder as shown in the old photo above. I usually like to try and take photos of my own lamb feedlot, but we've successfully eliminated it, which is fantastic. And yeah, I don't have any recent photos, so apologies for the really old school photo of it, but that's what it will tend to look like. So if you've seen that out in your pens, that's water belly or urinary calculi is a sort of technical term there. But yeah, really not nice, and there's really no turning back from that point. You need to sort of euthanize your animals. But the most common causes when you're just grain feeding, so if you don't have an additive in there or a balancer pallet, grain itself is really low in calcium and really high in phosphorus. So lambs need at least a calcium to phosphorus ratio of 1.5 or 2 to 1, so 2 times as much calcium as phosphorus, and grain is completely the other way around. So that's one of the reasons why these little stones can form, and it's a really common one. The other one to consider too is actually high magnesium levels. So whilst lambs need magnesium to grow for a whole host of reactions in the body, too much magnesium will also interfere with the calcium and phosphorus, and is a point of where the stones will form as well. So the high magnesium levels in your feed can do that. And one thing that people don't necessarily think about if they think they've got their ration actually balanced is their water supply. So if you're on bore water, and I've got a note there, just how to reduce urinary calculi is to test your bore water as well, and just have a check on your magnesium levels to see that you're not influencing it via the water as well. And the third sort of cause we see is too much protein in the ration. So really high protein diet, so not quite balanced to suit that lamb. In the right blend, apart from costing too much money, having too much protein in there, it's quite expensive. It can be a cause of urinary calculi, as well as if that lamb's trying to excrete excess. It can be a point of causing that urine pH to rise as well. So how to reduce urinary calculi. So I mentioned about testing your bore water. So good water is one, because you want them to keep flushing through. We want to make sure we've got a good calcium level in there. So we want to increase the calcium content in there to try and balance up that calcium to phosphorus ratio. And if people might be adding things like dolomite and those sort of things, which are also bringing magnesium, it's just really important to keep a watch on all of that to make sure you're not inadvertently bringing excess magnesium into that ration as well. So keep an eye on the magnesium levels. We want to have a little bit of salt in there. Sodium chloride is required by the body, but it also helps keep those lambs drinking and flushing everything through. And sort of the kicker there at the end is what we call anionic salt. So anionic just is a negatively charged ion, and usually a sulfate or a chloride that's used. And what that does is actually make the urine more acidic. So we want the urine to be acidic because it actually dissolves any little stones or stops them from forming, in fact, in the first place. So when the urine is, we're talking about pH before, when the urine of the pH becomes more alkaline, that's when all those minerals start to come together to form the stone. So by keeping it more acidic, we can prevent those stones from forming or keeping them at bay so they can be passed through at the very least. And that's been probably the biggest success story of vitamin buff and a lot of feedlots that we deal with, is that we've effectively eliminated urinary calculi in their feedlots for them, which has been a big issue as well. So it's really due to the balanced mineral profile, adding these anionic salts, and that's really helped people remove the incidence in urinary calculi. And we actually saw that in the trial work we first did with vitamin buff in the early days, where we put it up against some competitors, and they still whilst they weren't just more profitable because they grew faster, they were actually more profitable, the lambs, because there were nil deaths from urinary calculi, which is what happened in some of the competitor pens as well. So, their growth rates were still a little bit, pretty good. Like, we were just sort of ahead on growth rates, but the profitability really came from the no deaths, and the other ones had urinary calculi. So it really affects your bottom line in that sense.
Great. So we've just discussed our two main nutritional effects on mortality, acidosis and urinary calculi. However, there are some other potential causes of poor performance in the feedlot. This year in particular, we may see some weather damaged grain and roughage, and whilst it may not look too bad, there are often some hidden dangers. Today we have our guest speaker, Kate from Bioman. Thanks for joining us, Kate. Kate can talk to us today about mycotoxins. What are they and where do they come from?
Great, thanks Jess and Nicole. Morning everyone. Mycotoxins are toxic compounds that are naturally occurring and produced by fungi. Global industry billions of dollars every year by reducing feed quality, impairing animal health and performance. So most of the mycotoxins found in feed are produced in the field during the growth of the plant. We establish symbiotic relationships for the benefit of plants through competitive advantage against other organisms. The common practice of no-till can actually increase the probability of fungal prevalence in the field from previous crops. Fungal spores are resistant to adverse weather conditions and, given the right conditions, infect the plant and growth. So currently, I guess we're experiencing those said adverse weather conditions trending to an El Niño season. We're seeing higher rainfall and experiencing humid weather. So this is giving us a shorter window for curing time for hay. And through the spring, we've seen difficulty in getting into some of those paddocks for chopping silage and now potentially harvesting grain. So during harvest, toxin levels remain steady from the most in the field. And from here, two choices are usually made. A mold inhibitor or inoculant is used that can stop further fungal growth and production of other mycotoxins. Or in the case an inoculant is not used, other types of molds can develop in time and, with bad storage conditions, increase mycotoxin load. So molds can be present but produce little or no mycotoxin spores. Alternatively, there's what appears to be small amounts of mold present can actually produce a high level of mycotoxins as a response to the they're under. So in regards to inoculants and things like that, it's probably best to speak further with your farm consultant. So mycotoxins are difficult to detect by eye. So they're not visible at all. They're tasteless. They have no smell, and I recommend not going out to your silage pits or sniffing your hay because farmer's lung can come out of that and make you quite crook. They're chemically stable and they're heat resistant. And of course, there's no vaccine. It's often said that yeast and mold counts can be used as a method of detecting mycotoxin risk. The case, and like looking at that picture of the beautiful corn there, just looking at that, they might actually not contain a high load of mycotoxins. So we at Bioman and Robo pride ourselves in over 30 years experience in this field, a comprehensive testing method known as the Spectrum Top 50. This allows us to test for over 50 different mycotoxins and metabolites, including mice mycotoxins that previously hadn't been able to detect. We work on high sensitivity and specificity and deliver a 360-degree report on what we achieved on finished feeds and raw materials. So these past 9 months, Labs has analysed over 15,000 samples across 24 countries, and CopRice takes full advantage of this service and is implemented as part of their Q&A program to ensure the best protection against mycotoxins is achieved for their customers. Yes, I guess getting to this new season of hay, grain and straw, there's something to be aware of, that there may be an increased risk of mycotoxins this year.
Great. That's interesting to know what mycotoxins are and where they come from. But how do they affect our livestock and livestock performance?
So I guess, as you can see here on the left in that wheel, it affects all species. So her performance can be impacted at subclinical levels, keeping in mind that low consistent levels of toxins can have an effect, and co-contamination of different mycotoxins can affect that load as well. The immune suppression, fertility reduction, and at the time people are thinking of their females, but it actually includes rams and bulls as well. So decreasing nutrient utilization through the disruption of the gut integrity, loss of appetite or feed refusal we can see. And in other cases, not seeking shade on a hot day, standing or craning in dams around troughs. Laminitis, unsettled behaviour, and clinical deaths. Yeah, clinical effects such as death can occur. It's pretty extreme, but not as common in Australia. So as we look to the right side of this slide at the inverted triangle, we can see the range of mycotoxins from easily bound by absorption to least. Common belief that all mycotoxins can be absorbed, and that's just not true. For example, the chemical structures of aflatoxin are polar and flat. We can liken it to our bacon and egg roll that some of us may have had this morning. The bacon and egg is the aflatoxin, and the binding substance, our bentonite, is the roll. So that gives you a bit of an idea. For this reason, product Mycofix, we have included enzymes for more intricate chemical structures of deoxynivalenol and zearalenone. Enzymes are thousands of times faster than binders, as they're actively targeting only the specific mycotoxins against which they're designed. Once a mycotoxin is converted into a non-toxic metabolite, the reaction is irreversible. Developing enzymes is by no means an easy task, and there are many safety and efficacy requirements that we at Bioman were able to fulfill with each regulation, and we're the only company with this technology. Mycofix is the gold standard when it comes to mycotoxin protection, and it can be found in the vitamin buff range. Thanks, Jess.
Awesome, thanks Kate. So now we know that mycotoxins can have a serious effect on livestock performance. How do we protect against them?
So for countering diverse mycotoxins in the animal, a comprehensive approach is required. Mycofix addresses this with 3 complementary strategies of absorption, which is effective on aflatoxins and ergot. Our premium quality bentonite found in the Mycofix range fulfills the strict requirements on aflatoxin binding capabilities, binding over 90% according to the EU reference. Its efficacy is proven, and we're the only product in the world to hold European authorizations. So next we have biotransformation. So these are our unique combination of patent and biological components that convert mycotoxins into non-toxic, environmentally safe metabolites. As with bentonite, our enzymes are the first and only microorganisms authorized in the EU as substances for reduction of the contamination of feed of deoxynivalenol, fumonisins, and zearalenone. These specific enzymes biotransform metabolites in the GI tract of animals. And finally, our bioprotection blend to safeguard the vulnerable cells of the gut wall, supporting the liver and immune system. So if you'd like further information, get in touch with Nicole or Jess, and I'll be more than happy to assist.
Thanks, Kate and Nicole. So, feed additives play an important role in improving animal health, the profitability of a lamb feedlot. In today's webinar, we discussed how to increase profitability by maximising quantity sold. So, we discussed the 2 key nutritional issues, acidosis and urinary calculi, and how we can focus on improving rumen health and then in turn reducing or eliminating the incidence of both of these. Furthermore, this season, mycotoxins can be more prevalent. By including a proven and researched mycotoxin binder, we can assist in reducing morbidity rates, optimize lamb health, and increase profitability.
Now, as we'll jump into questions. So we might kick off with some that were pre-submitted, and then I can see that a few are coming through. Please do jump on into the Q&A box there to type any questions you may have for our nutritionists and guest speakers. But first, I'm going to put this question out. We've got a question here from Jim. So what quality and type of forage do you recommend for a feedlot diet?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. So as they come into the feedlot in induction, I do like a particularly palatable hay, if it's possible. So it's not always possible, but if you have a legume plant-based or a legume, cereal hay like a clover rye or a vetch, even lucerne. That's nice during induction because we're just encouraging them to eat that roughage as they adjust to grain. And then you can move on to a cereal hay. If it's not possible, and we don't typically do that at home, we have a bit of a combination we have a combination of vetch and some cereal hay, but you can just start on cereal hay or straw. The key factor is that it's palatable. So we just want fresh hay. We don't want rodent damage. We don't want weather damage. It's got to be hay that they want to eat. And that's really the critical part of it. So whilst, we talk about quality, typically, protein levels and that sort of thing, quality in my mind too is fresh, palatable hay, a nice fresh straw or header tailings even, that's okay too, as long as it's fresh and palatable and we don't have the weather damage. We do have the mycotoxins in there, mycotoxin binders in there to help prevent that, because this season it's going to be a little bit harder to possibly select hay like that, but it's as long as it's palatable and not too weather damaged and rodent damaged and all that sort of thing. That's what you want. We've had an incident in the last couple of years with the drought and hay supply sort of drying up. But the drought hays and straws are really quite sweet, so they were really palatable, too palatable sometimes, but it makes sure that rumen stays healthy if they can get that roughage as well. So yeah, fresh and palatable is what we were looking for.
Perfect. Thanks, Nicole. So we have another question here from Laura. So can you feed without roughage in a feedlot?
That's another great question that we get asked a lot. And it's advised to always have good quality roughage available. So our lambs and even our cattle, they were designed to graze, graze roughage or feed on offer in a paddock. So it's essential for rumen function. So we talk about scratch factor, or as Nicole was talking about earlier, the length of your fibre. That's really important for increasing saliva production and providing a natural buffer. It's also really important to the presence of particles greater than about that muzzle length to stimulate receptors in the rumen wall. That increases mixing and contractions. So better, and then that also presents your nutrients and particles to your papillae and better absorption of your nutrients. So it really is important for rumen health and production to have good quality roughage available.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. So we've got another one here from an attendee. Does cud chewing help with buffering?
Yes, that's most definitely. And just as Jess indicated there, that the more that they chew, the more fibre you come in, they will chew their cud a bit more, and then that's creating saliva. So anytime saliva is created, it contains bicarbonate ions and phosphate ions, and they will contribute to helping the buffering capacity of the rumen, and will obviously flow down the esophagus into the rumen and help a little bit in keeping that pH maintained at a relatively neutral level.
Perfect. I think that's it for the questions that have come through. If anybody has any other questions, please do email them through to our CopRice team. We're more than happy to answer any further questions and assist you on any product information or nutrition questions that you have on farm. So call through to our friendly customer service, or we'll direct you through to get in touch with our nutritionists. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to our guest speakers, and we will hope to see you in our session 3. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.